Thank you so much. Very happy to be here. Also, after listening to Mario's wonderful presentation, I had the feeling of doing something very unusual, and that is beg. Peter, please give me time to respond. Not now, because I prepared a totally different talk, but there's so much interest in there, and I've been working on that so much. I need 15 minutes. I'm prepared to give the talk outside or on the toilet, but I have to say something at some point, okay? But I hope there is space in the program. But, yes, I will talk about something totally different. I was really very happy with the invitation for this conference, because it actually brings me back 35 years in time, and to a topic that I haven't been discussing for 35 years since then. And I felt very much willing to try to tackle it again. But I have to say, I listened to some wonderful presentations this morning and some very excellent debates, by the way, that I think I'm coming as a philosopher from a very different kind of direction than at least very many of you. I'm very much from the analytical philosophy. Worse, maybe, I am the only philosopher in a science building. All my colleagues, and I really mean all of them, and there's about 150, 200, are either cognitive neuroscientists or they're people working in artificial intelligence. And I've been working there for the last 25 years, and I can tell you that does something to you. It changes you. And so it's always very wonderful to be amidst philosophers. But so I decided to give my talk on a plurality of agents to collective engagement, but from a kind of science, analytical philosophy kind of perspective, trying to build bridges with the more continental tradition that I see here very strongly, and that I value very much. I read loads of Heidegger and Foucault when I was younger. And I will focus especially on two things: embodied embedded cognition and information and communication technology, and the way that influences our possibilities for collaborative action, and also sometimes the ways in which it blocks our possibilities for collaborative action. And there's one reason I want to discuss embodied embedded cognition with you. That is that when I talk with neuroscientists, and I just explained there are lots of them around, it's practically the majority of the people I see, they tend to be, don't tell them I said this, very stupid. For them, the brain is the only thing that counts. They're absolute, hardcore, dedicated neurocentrists. I sometimes have debates with my colleagues, and they say, well, you know, me as a person, I am my brain. And then I say, what do you mean you are your brain? If you would say that to me, you know, you would cut me short for just about 1.70 meters and for a lot of kilos. I am much more than just this little gray mass that's inside the skull. Also, I tell them, you know, so what does that mean, you are your brain? If we go out on a walk, and afterwards I say, gee, I'm tired of walking, you would have to say something like, gee, I'm tired of being carried around in my skull all the time. Is that what you really mean? And then some people say yes. Really crazy. So I want to introduce, or reintroduce, or refresh your memory, embodied embedded cognition as something that very clearly indicates how important our body is for our cognition. And a central concept from Scott Kelso, from self-organization theory, dynamical systems theory, is intrinsic dynamics. And with intrinsic dynamics, he basically means the kind of spontaneous coordination tendencies of our body. Maybe you know this concept very well. I don't see fingers raised immediately. So I get bored and I can move my arms in this direction very easily, but of course I cannot move them the other way around. Which is why when I have an itch here, there's no problem. But when it's in between my shoulder blades, I need outside assistance, right? What you see in very young infants is what they sometimes call motor babbling. You see all these random movements when they're in the crib, and it's a little bit like babbling, you know, with the face where they cannot speak, but they make sounds. They go da boo da boo da da, and then at some point it comes out mama or papa, that kind of stuff. What you see when you see a child or a young infant in the crib, you're making these movements, is motor babbling. It's trying to understand the intrinsic dynamics of its body. Okay, so that's what you see, a kind of mapping, mutual getting to know each other between the control system, let's say the brain, and the body. But I think there's even more to embodiment than that. And this is my favorite experiment from developmental psychology. I'm not sure you've seen this before. So this is an infant of around 8 months. Around 8 months it can crawl, but not walk yet. Most of them anyway. It doesn't know, most of the time under normal circumstances raised, what a slope is. And so it doesn't know that from slopes you can fall. It doesn't know, so it's not afraid. So it goes, and it falls. 1 time, 2 times, 3 times. By time 4, these infants start thinking whether here, no, thank you. So traditionally, you would think, okay, so what these infants have learned is the concept of slope. They know what a slope is. Not the word maybe, not the vocabulary, but the idea, the meaning of it. Then by 12 months, they can start to walk. Now you would think that if you know that a slope, you cannot go down on the slope with 4 contact points, you most certainly cannot with 2, right? Guess what happens? When you put them in standing position before the slope, hopla, and down they go. 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, no thank you. The effect is so strong that Adolf, who did the experiment originally, reported 1 case where a child in crawling condition was in front of the slope and refused to go on, was put on its feet, and then, what does that mean? It means that our knowledge about the world is not abstract, but is intrinsically connected to our sensory motor capacities in the world. A slope while crawling is something different than a slope while walking. And you have to relearn these things. That's how embodied our concepts are. And I find that a very good lesson and an antidote to neuroscientists and neurocentrism. You may remember the time when you learned to drive. You know, when you're in a car, learning to drive is not about the steering in itself or, you know, the clutch and those kind of things, I'm messing around with the pedals. It's much more about learning to think differently, because suddenly your car body is much bigger than you were, much faster, much less capable of maneuvering, and that's what learning driving lessons are all about. That your control system, like the motor babbling example, has to relearn the new intrinsic dynamics of your car body. So I think, you know, bodies offer opportunities for our behavior. They offer constraints. Sometimes there's things we cannot do, like scratching your back. And sometimes it's phrased as bodies have a mind of their own. So that's embodiment. I think it's very crucial and a good lesson to, let's say, neuroscientists, but maybe also to some philosophers who are very cerebrally inclined. Then there is embeddedness. And here I think the crucial notion is scaffolds. So when you build a house, you build all kinds of structures in preparation, and you can climb on them, and then you put the stones on top of one another, and then you can go down again. The Dutch word is stijgers. I wouldn't for the life of me know what the word is in Serbian. Structures that you create in order to build a building. Scale. Thank you so much. So we do that all the time. We create structure in our environments to simplify our cognitive processes. So I saw someone writing something down, for instance, when I was introducing the notion of scaffold. That's very smart. Why? If somebody tomorrow asks what is scaffolding, you don't have to do a memory task, but you can do a perception task. You read your notes. And we all know, from our time as students, that memorizing is hard, remembering is hard, but reading is easy. Which is why we would scribble all these secret answers to stuff on the palm of our hand. Or maybe that was just me during student time. Okay, so that's scaffolding. Andy Clark, who came up with these notions in following up Vygotsky and others said, it's a little bit like the James Bond principle. Know only what you need to know. These days, my students call this the Wikipedia principle. If you can find it on Wikipedia, you don't have to memorize anything. So we create outside structures to avoid having to think, to avoid having to engage in costly cognitive activity, because we take the structure in the environment as a supplement for it, as a replacement for it. What is not often mentioned, that actually, and here I come to the collaborative action, is that our most important scaffolds are not just objects in the world, pieces of paper, books, or computers, but other people are our most important scaffolds. We look at people as ways to offload our cognitive activity. I sometimes call this the follow mom and dad principle. So when you're walking with a group of people, you very often see that there's one or two people in the front and they have a map and they know where they're going and they go, we turn left. And everybody else is sort of going blah, 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 and they just follow the leaders, the ones in front. So that's not having to think by just following others. So that's what we do. Search the ones you agree with. We've invented a word for this. We say friends. And then we simply stay close following copy. That way we don't have to engage in a lot of cognitive effort. Of course, we can do this. We can disagree with our friends. We can decide to walk in the front, etc. But these are normally exceptions to the rule. Our daily life activities are really different. Embodiment and embeddedness. Now I want to move to collaborative action and the influence of information communication technology on collaborative action, ICT for short. So I looked at a very interesting paper of Judith Butler, the 2011 paper. It's called Bodies in Alliance and the Politics of the Street. And I just want to summarize some things that I think are very important in that paper. She starts out by Hannah Arendt's idea that political action requires a space of appearance. And that for politics to take place, the body must appear in that space or create that space. This is very important. And when reading that and thinking about my talk, I went back to 1980, when I was 20. And a particular experience that was very important for me. I was a member of the squatters movement in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. We had a lot of activity for about 6 years, from 79 to 86 more or less. But especially in 1980 there were many activities to which I contributed with all my force, heart and soul, I can tell you, that were really creating these kind of spaces. And one in particular I would like to mention, the Vondelstraat. This was a place that was squatted because it was empty and it wasn't used, and there were many people at that time who needed the house. We also squatted empty offices that were used for speculation parts, etc. And this is very well known because we got barricades in the street. And they were ultimately, we re-squatted this at Friday, and on Monday morning it was evacuated, removed everything through tanks. It's the only time in Amsterdam that tanks were driving there since the Second World War, and they haven't been back since then. It's the Netherlands. But the most important picture actually is the one in the middle, this one. Because this is what happened on Saturday. I've been there all those days. And I remember on Saturday that people outside the barricades, so this was the apartment, these were the barricades and there were several down the line, came to talk with the squatters. Some brought even some food, some apples or some blankets. Others just came to shout at us and disagree with us. But there was communication. So this political space of appearance was created. The main thing that happened, I realized then, but I couldn't articulate, I think I can now, was not the barricades, but was this space, this place where people met and discussed stuff. And I think that that is a very important thing of this arena, this space of appearance, that when you create it, how do you create it, and how, and that's my particular topic, does information and communication technology influence this, and how can we understand this? So this is the space I really focus on. So what Judith Butler says that the action that creates actually this kind of space and our freedom is not the body made itself, but happens between bodies through collective interaction. And here I think ICT comes into play. She notices something important as well, that this appearance has to be registered. And that is why I think these kind of barricades are so important. Barricades get you registered. But it's not the barricades that do the political action, it's the talking and the communication. So the appearance has to be registered by others. And here comes ICT into play. So this is from the Tahrir Square, 2011. And Butler says it matters that those bodies carry cell phones relaying messages and images. And I find this picture very impressive. You can really see people very seriously recording a speech that was going on at that time. And this is true. Information and communication technology, smartphones and what have you, allow you to communicate to a wider audience. But I think ICT, smartphones are much more than a megaphone that's more modern. Okay, and I want to discuss a little bit with you, and here I become much more speculative, what that role, what that contribution could be. And I want to go back to a notion that's also very much related to embodied embedded cognition from a biologist from the 30s, von Uexküll, who speaks about our Umwelt. He has studied, at that time, the Umwelt, the, let's say, meaningful environment of animals. And he drew very beautiful pictures of them. So this is the environment as we would see it, as human beings would see it. But if you would draw it from the perspective of a bird or an insect, it would most likely look very different. You know, most of the details are gone because they're irrelevant to what it can be considered meaningful in terms of goals and survival and interaction, etc., for that particular animal, insect or bird. And actually in the distance, every detail is totally gone. There are just a few things that highlight because that's what the animal can respond to. So it's the sensory system that determines the Umwelt. It's the motoric capacities, what you cannot reach is irrelevant. And it's the goals, it's, let's say, the organization of survival, etc., that the animal is informed in, that determines what it perceives of the world. And I think that just what ICT does, smartphones and other equipment, internet, cloud, web, is doing that. It changes our Umwelt. It makes us see other things, maybe more things. Sometimes it makes us ignore things that we saw in the past. We have a lot of people doing their iPhone stuff on the bike. You suddenly start ignoring a lot of stuff that's actually very important to your survival, so that's a kind of problem. And it also affects our agency, our doing things, our capacity to do things in the environment. And now I if only to make up with my colleagues that are just so insulted from the cognitive neuroscience department, I want to say briefly something about neuroscience. Because I think we need to study this better, but we haven't done so yet in relation to ICT, what the effects are of technology on our brain. But we did so with tools, and I just want to give you one example to illustrate what I mean. So this is a paper, very interesting, by Maravita and Iriki, and they looked at response profiles of sensory motor neurons in the infraparietal cortex, where information is integrated from the sensory motor cortex with visual information. So you can feel, you can do certain things, and you can connect it with seeing. That's what happens in those neurons in that particular area. And they looked at how the visual field of those sensory motor neurons actually increased after active tool use. And this meant actually quite a lot. It's not just that active tool use changes what you can do because you can reach further. No, it also affects your perception. You start seeing different things further away because suddenly you've learned that these things become important to you because they are reachable. So your Umwelt, so to speak, enlarges. It has grown. Also, objects and events previously outside of your zone of interest are now suddenly in and become relevant. So you start making distinctions in terms of valence, for instance, that you were not making before. And there's a wonderful, another experiment with infants I like developmental psychology a lot because it shows sometimes phenomena in a very pure form, where children were stuck in a chair, a children's chair, basically, and they were all around 12 months. Children learn to walk at different ages. You know, it's more or less around 12 months, but some at 12 are so-called pre-walkers. They don't have the capacity to walk yet. Others actually can already walk. They're the walkers, same age, but different talent for walking, let's say. And they were showing balls at various distance, nicely colored balls or balloons that they would like to have. If it was close within reach, both children would reach. If it was outside their reach, like saying where you're sitting right here, then the pre-walkers would not move. They would stay in their chair. They would look at it, but wouldn't do anything. The walkers, even though they couldn't get out because they were, tied up a little bit to prevent them from falling down, were really trying very hard to climb out. So they responded different. Their umwelt had changed because what was there was in reach. They learned that through walking. You only had to do something with it. I think information and communication technology has a similar kind of effect on our understanding that suddenly things that in other cases wouldn't have led to a response are becoming within our reach, or that they are becoming important. That's the basic idea. Now, unfortunately, we don't have, I say unfortunately because the Donders Institute pays me and it's a neuroscience institute, so it would be nice to have neuroscience. No, I really think that that's an interesting question. We know certain brain areas are involved in social cognition. I would love to see studies that indicate or investigate how brain processes change under influence of ICT experience. I would be very curious to see what kind of brain circuits would be rewired, or not in the idea that that explains everything. Like I said, I think embodied embeddedness is crucial to the whole story, but to complete the picture. Unfortunately, we don't have these studies, so I need to conceptually speculate a little bit, and I hope you can follow my maybe weird sense of reasoning. I want to start with a, I think, very interesting chapter in a book, actually, by Malafouris, what he calls the dance of agency. He speaks of material agency. And he takes the example of a potter that makes a vase out of clay. And he says the potter and the clay are together in what I think is a very nice phrase, in a kind of collective dance. You know, the clay is turning around, it's moving, and you can see when they build the vase, there's actually a kind of action and contrary-wise action, and the shape goes up too fast, so you have to go slow, etc. It's not someone who does something to an initiativeless object. It's actually two entities, one of them living, other purely material, that dance together in the creation, the act of creation. I think that is very true. So it's not just humans or objects, but the relationship and engagement between humans and non-humans. And I think this goes also for smartphones, websites, etc. They have considered their material, there's nothing agency-like in there of themselves, but they have a lot more agency than clay. As we know, iPhones can, get you into action, send you alerts, signals. You can ask them and they will remind you later. They can act intelligently, sometimes even proactively, scheduling apps, etc. So there's much more agency in there. They can also alert you to whom to alert. And this is something, I think, that is very much related to this dance of agency. It's not just a dance between me and the iPhone, it's actually a collective dance between me, several of you, many of you, and the intermediate technology that enables it. So this is, I think, one way of conceptually understanding what ICT does. It changes our embodied, embedded situation by allowing us to partake at various different levels of aggregation in this kind of collective dancing. There's another thing I think that you can mention here, and this is based on Goldman's notion of social epistemology. He says individuals are members of a knowledge environment. And these knowledge environments are structured by all kinds of social practices regarding the acquisition, processing, transmission, and assessment of information. And we build that up as a community of scientists, for instance, where we agree about, what is truth assessing methodology, what is the worth of replication studies, etc. So this is very much coming from science, but I think it applies much more broadly. So they also give rise to certain epistemic expectations within the community. And I always think about Facebook. Personally, I hate Facebook, but if I want to communicate with my students on about courses. We have a special software environment, Blackboard. Maybe you use that here too. No, they don't use that. Email. Who's using email these days? You post it on Facebook. Why don't you post it on... So now I'm on Facebook for my students. But being on Facebook, I suddenly noticed, and I'm sure you all know much better than me with more experience, if you have, that there are certain expectations about what the informational constraints and do's and don'ts are. You have to like things. And so now I told my students, please don't like what I do, because otherwise I have to like you back. And to me that's such a waste of time that I don't want to, but I don't want to be impolite. So that's, I think, what's meant here too. It's more than just, true values of propositions. So this is what ICT does. It helps to shape the knowledge environment. And again, much more actively than the clay helps the potter. And just to give a very brief example, this is not my expertise, but I looked at several papers describing the role of ICT in the Arab transitions, Arab Spring, depending on the way you see it. And I think these are all quotes that make a point in that sense. Someone today said something very beautiful, I thought, about horizontal solidarity versus top-down charity. And I think this is what ICT allows, at least in certain cases. It allows for horizontal integration and solidarity. And this is what many people that studied the function of ICT in Arab transition movements say, is it played a crucial role in leaderless revolutions, largely grassroots, across the board, horizontal movements, with a bottom-up rather than a top-down structure. Collective and effective process of group mobilization, this collective dancing that I referred to earlier, both online and offline, promoting civil engagement, ability to reach widely dispersed and highly diverse segments of the population, both within the country and outside, etc. So what I think we should do is to study much more precisely than what I just very briefly indicated, how ICT affects these forms of collaborative action, how they enable it, how they facilitate it, how they make it possible under which kind of circumstances. Of course, nobody is naive. We also know the dangers that ICT presents. So now I go to the second part, for collective engagement, because ICT is a very two-sided kind of weapon. And this is also something that Kame says in this, I think, very interesting paper. They're not a magical tool. No, absolutely they're not. There are actually very many downsides, and I want to just mention 5 of them. I'm still doing reasonable with the time? 5 minutes? Yeah, I can make that. So this is the first downside, Slacktivism. You may have heard that term before. It's that people tweet their outrage, and that's it. Judith Butler very much emphasized, and I totally agree, that the actual bodies have actually to go out there and be there, in space. ICT presence is not a replacement of physical bodies in the actual, sphere of appearance. It has to happen out on the street. If nothing happens there, nothing happens. But of course it can support. But Slacktivism is one of the dangers of ICT knowledge. The second one is division. So I'm sure you've heard of Uber. Actually, they brought it in a very political sense, like the democratization of services, making the relation between server, like cab drivers, and the client very direct and democratic, bypassing the central organizations that run taxi companies like we do in Amsterdam. I have no idea how it's done here. But when you look at it, actually, what you see is that the drivers, after working for some time with their own car very cheaply, suddenly started realizing a very crucial thing. Maybe Uber and the technology made them into direct contact with the customer, but it blocked the communication between the drivers amongst themselves. And it did that on purpose, So at some point, what they started doing was actually, first of all, go out to the street in front of the office of Uber. It's a software, you know, it's an app kind of company, but you go to the place, the physical place in front of their front door, because that's where the political action happens. But also they start trying to build up unions. They wanted to have that horizontal connectivity that was taken away from them through the technology. So here the ICT technology is doing the opposite of what I indicated earlier, and it allows this. And it's very interesting. This is a quote from the spokesman of the United States, Uber. "We work with drivers one-on-one," he says, adding that Uber drivers don't need a union presenting their interests. So this is the second one, division. You can use the same technology that you can use for horizontal integration and collective dancing also in precisely the opposite way. Downside 3, snooping. Snowden NSA, for sake of time, I will just move on, right? We know. Downside of ICT4, nudging. Maybe you've heard of the filter bubble. The idea that you get information that is actually pointed at you because of your previous interests that you displayed on internet, which basically means that when I search for something like Egyptian protests, get maybe information about travel information. I'll play the bad guy. Whereas you get information about Egyptian protests. And that divides us further. We just see different things of the world. And we don't even know because we did a search on Google. And Google searches everything. Yeah, sure, but it presents what it thinks you want, or better, what it thinks it can make the most money out of you way. Persuasive technologies. I have a colleague who is working in this field. He's right next door to my office. And he says, no, this is actually wonderful. What we do is look at how you search and when you decide to buy and what you click on, etc., based on the way we present this information. And we make sure you're more happy with the choices you make. Because we give you exactly the information in a way that we know that you want to be presented in that way. He says it's very funny. He gave me this example seriously. He said, some people actually buy more when the product is more expensive. So we know this from their clicking behavior, and so they get the object for a higher price. And this makes them happy, according to my colleague, right? Very dangerous, because it's this nudging and it's this subconscious influencing, etc., that we find it very hard to resist. Last aspect, 3 slides, I think. Control. So this, I think, is a very excellent, very brief paper about the 4 phases of internet control. And basically he says there are 4 phases. The first one was open internet, basically from the beginning till the end of the 90s, where anything goes. Then access denied, where the states and authorities started simply blocking and cutting you off. To 2005, then access controlled and access contested. And I just want to briefly mention these 2 and emphasize the importance of the last phase, the access contested. Access controlled basically means that the interaction is much more subtle of the authorities. It's not just blocking across the board, basically going to the central connectors and then telling them to shut down or blocking whole topics, etc. It's much more a variety of mechanisms to limit access to knowledge and information at the right moment. So for instance, China, close to the 20th and the 25th anniversary, the commemoration of the Tiananmen Square protest, suddenly blocked down certain Google issues, but left everything intact. And after the commemoration was over, it was open again. So you get this very subtle, time-specific, location-specific kind of interference with your access to information. So that's access controlled. Now access contested. Paul Free notices several cases where people actually started protesting against the way their internet was being controlled. And so sometimes these proposals by the authorities were actually stopped and blocked and reverted in some cases. He also points out a global network initiative where there's now being worked on a code of initiative. And here I ask your special attention for the companies involved, the groups and the organizations involved. When I see LinkedIn, Facebook and Google, and actually Bill Gates is there as well, I get very suspicious. Maybe it's just me. At the same time, you see that they are actually working together with Human Rights Watch, which I take seriously, and other organizations of that kind, in order to really discuss how you can resist control by the authorities of these very basic social networks, etc. And so this is something that I think we need to pay much more attention to. So, to resume, this is my last slide. I talked a little bit about how embodied embedded cognition emphasizes bodily interaction with the environment. I emphasize that it does much more than just say that it's purely bodily interaction, but the importance for cognition. Also the importance of other agents for the way we think and perceive the world, Umwelt, etc. I said that ICT changes our sensory and motor capacities, affects our Umwelt and the kind of things we can do and the kind of things that we value in our environment. That it partakes in our collective dance of agency, and that it can help to shape our epistemic environment. But I also discussed the downsides of ICT, slacktivism, snooping, nudging, and division. And so I think a very important aspect of dealing with collaborative agency is to discuss in much more detail and with much greater urgency the role of ICT, not just as a tool for communication, it does that too, but also as a tool in which our cognition, our very thinking is shaped, and hence that what we care about. Thank you.